Reconstructing philosophy. In part 1, we looked at how Greek social class structure influenced philosophy. Just as action was tied to the lower classes, Greek philosophy depreciated change and action compared to the perfect ideal and unchanging. According to Dewey, this separation between knowing and doing carried forward into modern philosophy as well. This brings us back to the idea of Reconstruction. If philosophy is a response to human desires and needs, if it's a tool, then like any tool it can be changed and reformed to meet new demands and new problems. So what should philosophy do? According to Dewey, once we acknowledge that philosophy has been socially influenced in ways that are no longer relevant to contemporary life, it will become the job of philosophy to clarify social and moral problems that are relevant to our lives today.
Take food, for example. That's an important problem. How are we doing there?
In other words, Dewey is saying that philosophy has always served certain human interests, but once we recognize this, we can be more open about what interests we should pursue and adjust our philosophical interests and methods accordingly. So what does this reconstruction entail? Well, it means giving up the search for some facts or a reality that is completely independent of human interests. Discovering things about the world means acting within it, investigating, experimenting, and modifying it.
Anton van Leeuwenhoek, inventor of one of the first successful microscopes. After looking through his crude microscope, he made drawings of the microorganisms he saw. These represented organisms from tartar scraped from his own teeth.
As Dewey puts it, pure reasoning as a means of arriving at truth is like a spider who spins a web out of himself. The web is orderly and elaborate, but it is only a trap. Active experimentation must force the apparent facts of nature into forms different from those in which they familiarly present themselves. Truth claims are to be met with criticism and experimental testing, and primary interest in knowledge claims lie not with a metaphysical relationship, but with their ability to be of use to future inquiries and discoveries. Scientific knowledge, our most reliable kind of knowledge, is active. We cannot know the world by reasoning about metaphysics or merely observing it, but acting and experimenting in the world and seeing if our predicted hypotheses conform to the results we produce.
These, then, are the elements of the scientific method. First, perception of the problem. Second, preliminary observations to suggest solutions. Third, the development of one or more hypotheses. Fourth, the testing of these hypotheses through extended observation or experimentation. Fifth, the choice of a workable solution to the problem.
Humans act in the world in order to secure our ends and goals, and through further experimentation we may find whether those ends and goals are worth pursuing or not. A reconstructed philosophy, imbued with an active experimental understanding of knowledge, will commit itself to responding to social problems. What is meant by this? In Reconstruction and Philosophy, Dewey states, "Philosophy starts from some deep and wide way of responding to the difficulties life presents. Many of these difficulties are obvious. Can I really trust a knowledge claim? How should the state be organized? Am I a good person?"
A good citizen will perform basic civic duties, take part in group activities, know and obey the law, keep informed on public affairs, be a good neighbor.
All of these questions are relevant to how we ought to act in the world. They concern questions about what is worth and not worth pursuing. Consider again the Greek understanding of the world. All things share in some kind of ideal form. All things are imbued with some metaphysical purpose or ideal, and something could count as good if it conformed to that purpose or ideal. Values were a metaphysical part of the world. In other words, not only were objective values part of the world, but they fell on a hierarchy depending upon the species of thing it was. During the scientific revolution, scientific methodology overturned the idea that physical things act to conform to some ideal purpose. Things act because other things act on them. This is the mechanical understanding of physics. Later, the same experimental thinking of Darwin overturned the idea in biology of fixed species. So what happens to values? Are they still part of the world? Are they fixed ideals? There's no physical evidence of them, so are they part of the world or only subjectively in our heads? For Dewey, the importance of science lies not only in its ability to allow us to solve problems, but it gives us new problems to solve and new things to try to strive for. Thus, a reconstructed philosophy forswears inquiry after absolute origins and absolute finalities in order to explore specific values and specific conditions that generate them. Science is great at changing the means by which we are able to achieve our ends. For example, modern industrial farming practices allow for much higher food yields. This is important for values because for Dewey, what we can reasonably value depends on what means we are capable of using to achieve them. So while scientific experimental thinking is capable of affecting what we value, so far it has mostly affected what Dewey calls the means of life rather than its ends. In other words, he means we are good at using science to help us better achieve what we value, but not so good at using scientific reasoning to help us refine and improve what we value in the first place. And even then, it has mostly been accidental. For example, the internet has revolutionized the way we communicate, but most of its social benefits weren't planned in advance. While communication has become much easier, we also see that misinformation and fake news is now easier to spread as well. So while science has provided effective means of communication, it also presents a new problem about how and what we want to be communicated. We haven't taken the extra step and really begun to apply the experimental method to what we value and what we're trying to achieve, as this is what Dewey says defines the specific problem of philosophical reconstruction at the present time.
Almost everyone tries to think systematically, but some people find it hard to apply the scientific method to all the other problems that can be solved through observation and experimentation.
Did you hear? There's another epidemic down at the south end of town.
Oh, how terrible. You know, I think the town ought to do something about conditions down there.
Do something? What can they do? Look at the kind of people that live down there.
People? What do you mean? You can't just blame people for bad living conditions, for filth and disease and things like that.
Oh, I think you can. After all, that's the way that kind of people like to live.
I'm not so sure. I think the town ought to do a study of those conditions and get at the cause of it.
Some people let prejudice dictate the answers to problems. But thinking people realize that solving such problems requires systematic observation and the gathering of many facts. All the factors bearing on the problem have to be investigated. Then, the facts have to be studied to find the best ways of solving the problem. And finally, the most promising solutions have to be tested in practice. This scientific method of thinking applies to any everyday problem which lends itself to observation and testing, to problems of business as well as to problems of family life, to problems of law enforcement, as well as to problems of making the decisions of the community. This is the method of common sense thinking fully as much as it is the method of science.
Thus, scientific experimental thinking can be beneficial to how we think about values. The intellectual task of the 20th century for philosophy, as Dewey saw it, was to abandon unhelpful metaphysical questions and apply experimental thinking to improving our social and moral lives. He puts it this way: if insight into specific conditions of value and into specific consequences of ideas is possible, philosophy must in time become a method of locating and interpreting the more serious of the conflicts that occur in life, and a method of projecting ways for dealing with them, a method of moral and political diagnosis and prognosis. In essence, Dewey believes we must be prepared to apply experimental thinking to improving our daily lives, and, quote, when this step is taken, the circle of scientific development will be rounded out and reconstruction of philosophy will be made an accomplished fact. I'll discuss philosophical reconstruction at greater length in future videos, but we should now be able to return to what philosophical reconstruction means in a broad sense. What does Dewey mean by reconstruction? Well, it's clear that Dewey isn't suggesting that philosophy has lost its way and needs to be reconstructed as it was. Reconstruction can also mean rebuilding and revising, and it's clear that Dewey believes that experimental accounts of knowledge should be the guide to that reconstruction. Because of this, we should never aim for absolute certainty, as any new experience may undermine our deepest held beliefs. Thus, a reconstructed philosophy will take a fallibilist outlook, slowly revising and improving itself over time. Of course, one may ask about all those traditional philosophical questions that will go unanswered, like, do we really know the world? Or what lies beyond experience? Dewey's answer is that these questions start from bad assumptions in the first place, and that we should just give them up. In The Influence of Darwin on Philosophy, Dewey discusses the changing importance of philosophical questions. He notes, quote, "Intellectual progress usually occurs through the sheer abandonment of questions together with both the alternatives they assume, an abandonment that results from their decreasing vitality and a change of urgent interest. We do not solve them, we get over them." In part 1, we considered Dewey's early life, and there was an important reason for that. As I noted, Dewey believes that culture has a huge impact on philosophy, and it's worth considering how Dewey's own culture influenced his own thinking. Industrialization had a huge impact on Dewey's life, which is why his early life is so much more different from our own. Pragmatism was received in some circles as being an industrial philosophy, one that was fittingly American. For example, when pragmatism was first encountered in Europe, it was considered a hedonistic and utilitarian philosophy. Some European philosophers like Russell and Santayana accused pragmatism of being an industrial philosophy, with Russell stating that pragmatism was a philosophical expression of the love of truth being obscured by American commercialism. While this is an exaggeration, Dewey's philosophy does mirror industrial thinking. In his essay, Logic of Judgments of Practice, Dewey uses the analogy of building a boat to suggest that logic is itself a tool that we have refined in order to reach more secure conclusions. He begins by suggesting that all inquiries involve a practical component, and then suggests, quote, "If thinking is the art by which knowledge is practice, then the materials with which thinking deals may be supposed, by analogy with the other arts, to take on in consequence special shapes. The man who is making a boat will give wood a form which it did not have, in order that it may serve the purposes to which it is to be put. Thinking may then be supposed to give its material the form which will make it amenable to its purpose, attaining knowledge."
The elaborate paraphernalia of the scientist is nothing more than a tool for thinking, for a systematic way of looking at things and thinking problems through that we call the scientific method.
In essence, Dewey is suggesting that, like building a boat where we give wood a special form to serve a purpose, logic itself is a form of thinking which allows our thoughts to be ordered in such a way as to serve the purpose of knowledge production. Logic is a kind of thinking technology which is formed and reformed over time to serve our purposes. Given his position, it should come as no surprise that Dewey would believe that philosophy is also a tool which serves functions and which can and should be changed and reformed over time to serve new purposes. Dewey's philosophy disavows the kind of crass industrial utilitarian thinking that philosophers like Bertrand Russell charged him with. However, his rhetoric doesn't completely divorce itself from the industrial attitude that was taking place during Dewey's lifetime, and it would be silly to think that the dramatic changes taking place during his life didn't affect his own pragmatism. It's probably no surprise that the industrial and cultural reconstruction of society witnessed in his lifetime influenced the way that he thought about philosophy. After all, American society following the Civil War was one of dramatic change. When Dewey was born, only 20% of Americans lived in urban areas. By the time of his death, roughly 60% did.
The pattern of family life in America has undergone radical changes. On a farm in the 1880s, family life followed a pattern which had been characteristic of America from early colonial times.
During his lifetime, the American population grew from 31 million to 151 million. Much of this shift was driven by a rapidly industrializing economy which seemed poised to replace the United Kingdom as the world's leading manufacturer. Dewey's lifetime witnessed the invention of the car, the radio, the airplane, and nuclear fission. His world was constantly reconstructed throughout his life. Notice that Dewey has not presented an argument, at least in the traditional philosophical sense, against traditional philosophy. However, he has presented reasons for believing that the traditional goals of philosophy may not be rooted in what is purely rational, but rather what is social and cultural. The history of philosophy is not to be understood as isolated reasoning, but is connected with anthropology, the history of religion, and social and cultural institutions. Dewey uses this genetic method often in his works, recognizing both the importance that culture can have in our intellectual pursuits and the futility of using traditional logic to undermine philosophy's traditional assumptions. This method seeks to understand an idea by tracing the historical processes that brought it about. A good example of this method at work is found in Dewey's 1911 paper, The Problem of Truth, where he traces historical factors that made it necessary to develop the concept of truth, how truth and authority were related, and how truth was eventually given philosophical formulation. This approach is controversial because it directly involves this relationship between history, action, and knowledge that traditional philosophy rejects. Something is supposed to be true because it corresponds to objective reality, so the history of a theory or idea should be irrelevant to whether it is true or not. But if we reject the separation between knowledge production and practice, then it is no longer so controversial, particularly if the traditional framework itself is only a product of social influence. We must also remember that Dewey is not trying to demonstrate that a theory is true or false, but rather provide an analysis of the meanings we attach to ideas. He's not trying to argue that traditional philosophical theories are wrong, but that they are a response to problems that we need to get over because they reflect concerns that no longer matter. As I said, in future videos I'll be discussing Dewey's ideas about philosophical reconstruction at greater length, but in this video we've gotten a sense of the world that Dewey lived through and how it may have influenced his philosophy. This will be the first of a series of videos which will deep dive into some of Dewey's most important writings, and next time we'll be addressing his 1896 article, The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology. For now, however, we have a sense of what is meant by and what is at stake in philosophical reconstruction. For Dewey, the most important thing is that our habits of thinking are well suited to addressing the new problems that face us rather than the old.
The world is moving at a tremendous rate. No one knows where. We must prepare our children not for the world of the past, not for our world, but for their world, the world of the future.